It's been a while. And I'm here to talk to you about polity in the church. And polity is, I remember back in my freshman year in college, I had a political science course, and what is politics? What is polity? Polity is the allocation of power. And there's power to be allocated in the church, just like there is in your own family, in the rest of society. In the Presbyterian Church USA, this is where our source of power is. It fits so beautifully to what Nancy was reading us from Scripture. Where do you get your authority? In the Presbyterian Church, our power, sorry. Yeah, the screen. And that's that. What did we do, Janet?
Would you like some help?
The problem is these groups of the churches that are hierarchical, where they have doctrine that is built over the centuries, and they say, okay, the doctrine of 1492 says that we get our authority from Scripture, and the third source, beautiful. Just do a,
Would you like to places or just up
just
Roger.
okay. We're back from the beginning of the next one. We have the Book of Confessions. That's the big, it looks as a cover similar to your Book of Order. It's big and thick. Don't ever say, Ginny says the Book of Confessions is great, I'll go home and read it. I've tried that a couple times, and if you're really lucky, you might get through the Heidelberg Catechism. What the confessions are statements when, over the centuries, when the church has had some particular issue. And the first two are Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed came up when there were heresies in the church, one of which said that the idea that Jesus Christ was fully human and fully God couldn't possibly be true, therefore he was fully God, and forget about him having human weaknesses, so therefore he couldn't have died on the cross. It was, just a slideshow. Or not, given the way I'm doing with technology. And the other one said, well, he was really a good man. We all ought to emulate Jesus Christ, but he wasn't very God. So those two were heresies. And what the church did was bring together the best minds. They reasoned together. They came up with a statement. And our view is that these are subordinate standards, which means we pay a whole lot of attention to them, but we fully acknowledge that these were written by fallible human beings. We don't say, they couldn't err. We say councils may err. So but nonetheless, there's some pretty neat stuff. There's the Heidelberg Catechism, which was recently rewritten. That came out of the German tradition where it's directed at the people. So it asks questions like the Westminster Catechism does. Both of those are really good for getting short, pithy answers to little questions. From last century, the 20th century, there's one of my favorites. It's very short. It's the Declaration of Barmen, and it was written by German Christians in the early 1930s, at the time when Hitler was trying to use the church, take over the church, make it subordinate to the political arm of the government, and that the church would promote Hitlerian doctrines. And these folks said, no, the church takes its authority from Jesus Christ. So A lot of good stuff in that. The other thing I wanted to do was read to you what John Calvin said. Nancy was talking about, again, such a perfect segue, about sense of call and what authority do you have. And what John Calvin came up with, this is from not his big institutes, but from his Instruction on the Faith of 1537, so very early in his ministry. He wanted to attack the folks who end up on the other end of the spectrum, the ones who think that I've been to lay pastor class, therefore I'm really sliced bread, you know, I'm really great. So Calvin wrote this: in order that their ministry be not contemptible, pastors are furnished with a notable mandate to bind and to loose. And that, he went on, where I won't read, that means to forgive sins, or to say, you know, declare something to be a sin, having the added promise that whatever things they shall have bound or loosed on earth are in fact bound or loosed in heaven. But let us remember that this power, which in the Scripture is attributed to pastors, is wholly contained in and limited to the ministry of the Word. For Christ has not given this power properly to these men, but to his Word, of which he has made these men ministers. Hence, let pastors boldly dare all things by the word of God, of which they have been constituted dispensators. Let them constrain all power, glory, and haughtiness of the world to make room for and to obey the majesty of that word. Let them by means of that word command all from the greatest to smallest. Let them edify the house of Christ. Let them demolish the reign of Satan. Let them feed the sheep, kill the wolves, instruct and exhort the docile. Let them rebuke, reprove, reproach, and convince the rebel, but all through and within the word of God. But if pastors turn away from the word to their dreams and to the inventions of their own minds, already they are no longer to be received as pastors, but being seen to be rather pernicious wolves, they are chased away. For Christ has commanded us to listen only to those who teach us that which they have taken to his word. That just always gets me. Remember why it is we're up here, whose we are. It's not us, folks. It's Jesus Christ. Next thing is, for what do we exercise power in the church? And these three things that are up there are all found in what's called the Foundations of Presbyterian Polity. The first 15 pages, yes, first 15 pages. If you haven't read them, consider that an assignment. Beautifully written, but also they set out the basics. I mean, if you knew those and followed them, you probably wouldn't need the rest of the book. The rest of the book just kind of fills in. The great ends of the church, they are a gift to us. The one thing left in the Book of Order from the old United Presbyterian Church of North America, which is the tradition our Highland Park came from. And there's some elements, may still be some elements there in Juniata from the old First UP. And but the great ends of the church, the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God, the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. Good stuff. Why are we doing these things? The notes of the Reformed Church, which are, you can tell a church is in fact doing what it's supposed to if the word is rightly proclaimed if the sacraments are rightly observed, and if discipline is rightly maintained. So John Calvin said he acknowledged the Catholic Church to be a church because it did all three of those things, even though he didn't like a lot of the things they were doing. And the historic principles of church government, which are also there. They're in F301. That's how we know if we're using our power rightly, if we're doing it for the proclamation of the gospel, if we're doing it for the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God. And again, what are we doing all this for? Why do we have a church? Because we are called to tell the good news. We are called to heal and reconcile. We are called to a new openness. And that's F10302, very first or second page of the Book of Order. And what are those historic principles? God alone is Lord of the conscience. We believe in that power should be shared. We use the representative democracy, a representative government. That's why your congregations elect deacons and elders, trustees, elect pastors. We don't give the entire congregation all authority. They get limited authority. We believe in representative government, but we also believe in councils. Sometimes we used to call these governing bodies. The main thing is we do things by groups, not individuals. We share power. We believe, and that's basic to Calvin's belief and several others, that human beings are frail. Mark Taman, who was then the head of the Constitutional Services at General Assembly, when I'd call and say, I've got this problem, he'd say, total depravity, Jenny, total depravity. Well, that's why we do groups, because together we feel that we can reason together. We believe in majority vote. That means the guy with the loud mouth on your session, or gal, either, ladies can have shrill, strong opinions too. No one person gets to dictate. Shared power. Shared power means some power goes to the congregation, some power goes to the pastor, some goes to the people, some goes to the presbytery. Those also you can find in those first 3 chapters, particularly the 3rd chapter of the foundational principles. And if I don't tell you what they say, maybe you'll open your book. Let's talk, but delving in just a little more into the allocation of the ordered groups. These are the folks that our Book of Order allocates power to. The pastor, the congregation, the session, the presbytery. And these are when somebody comes and says to you, West Penn Power wants to put a transmission line across our property, and they're willing to pay us $10,000 to do it. Who gets to make that decision? That's the time you pick up your Book of Order. Always good to check twice. It's like a carpenter. You measure twice before you cut. You don't just cut it off and say, I hope this was right. Check on those things. If you're the pastor, most of you, some of you at least remember Peggy Kendall. The former pastor at Upper Spruce Creek was somewhat new, and the regional representative of the American Bible Society came to him and asked, offered to preach for him one Sunday, and he was happy to have that because he hadn't had a Sunday off in, dog's age. And the guy said, the only thing, you don't have to pay me. The only thing I ask is that you give me permission to make a sales pitch and offering for the American Bible Society then. And he said, oh, yeah, sounds great. And he told Peggy and Elizabeth Lake, and the next thing I saw, was him, he was bleeding all over it. They pointed out that offerings, the taking up of money, that's a session decision. And their session, apparently, they had too many of this guy's sermons and had decided they weren't going to have him anymore. But I remember he called me and he said, Peggy and Elizabeth said I couldn't do that. And I said, they're right. So we do things by ordered groups. Ordered groups are your sessions. Ordered means they're written up in the book of order. The ordered groups are the session, the presbytery, the synod, the general assembly. Notice I didn't mention the congregation because it is not an ordered group. Anybody who believes in Jesus Christ and is willing to support your church can and should be allowed to be a member. But your session, the ones who make the decisions for the church, that's your session. They are people who have been called by God and have demonstrated gifts for ministry, and the people of God, the congregation, have acknowledged that, and the session has examined them to make sure, to confirm this, and then they have been ordained and set apart for it. So they are ordered groups. The chapter 3 of your book of order deals with the councils of the church. The first part of that, first 4 or 5 pages, talks about the organization, the rationale, the calling in general for all ordered groups, and then it has sections on the session, the presbytery, the synod, the general assembly. So they are chosen for gifts of ministry and quality of life. Yeah, we're supposed to, all of you in this program are elders. We are called to exhibit in our life. We're not called to be perfect. We're called, though, to exhibit in our way of life qualities that one would see in the life of Jesus Christ. So the standards are a little bit higher than they are for being a member of the congregation. They are delegated, not popular. One of the tasks that I'm currently working on or have for the last year, Sam Strome and Cindy Carlisle and Carl Campbell and I have been working on policies in light of our new structure. Things, that we no longer have an AUT, so we got to put the name of the new group in for the trustees, kind of thing. That group of 4 people works pretty well. We share ideas. But if we were to try that in the middle of the whole presbytery, a meeting of 55 people, can you imagine how long your meetings would last? It doesn't work well that way. And there are people, not to say they're better, but they're gifted. Again, I'm one of the people who loves to write words. So you could call that my gift. That's why you made me stated clerk. On the other hand, Susan over here goes on mission trips regularly, and you want to know how to do mission, you go to Susan. She's really got that gift. She also is a good clerk, so I have to give her a lot of credit. But, you know, we all have different gifts, and there are folks who are good members of your congregation that you still don't want making the decisions, because that really is not their thing. The last part of ordered groups is we discern the will of God together. You may well be part, well, heck, our political government. You can get an absentee ballot, and you can vote your conscience and your absentee ballot. We don't do absentees in the Presbyterian Church because we believe in the Holy Spirit, not just Jesus and the Father, but the Holy Spirit. We believe that if the group sits together and reasons together, they will come out and listens and prays as they do this. The Holy Spirit will work through us. And the person who is laid up at home with a broken leg, they're not there, Jesus, you know, to hear that particular movement of the Holy Spirit. So now we go to authorities. You look up here and you'll see the list of authorities of a pastor. It's pretty limited. In the Presbyterian Church USA, the pastor has the right to choose the scripture, to choose his sermon topic and write it and say it, preach it, to create the prayers, choose the music. Caveat, he's accountable to the presbytery, or she, and the session. We had one pastor who early on in my tenure here preached a sermon against the Iraq War and then wondered why some people were unhappy. Well, you preach political sermons, you've divided your people. Never a good thing to preach a political sermon, because when you preach, you're saying people who accept my word are my people, and people who don't accept my word are not my people, and you've already lost part of your congregation. So you got to be really careful. Pastors do have, even though these are very limited, for example, the session authorizes the observance of the sacraments. Pastor can't go out baptizing individuals on her own, go out to, you know, the park, bald eagles, and dump them in the lake up there on her own and call it a baptism. Doesn't work that way. Same way, it's the session that it chooses the sacraments. Now, if you are the pastor and you believe that the sacrament is not going to be, it's not being appropriately scheduled, you have the right to say no. For example, child baptism. We do child baptism with the belief and understanding that the child we baptize to as an indication that this child is going to be raised in the faith. There has to be a parent who's going to teach the child Jesus Christ. There needs to be a congregation that is going to support that parent or parents. And so if you see, you know, grandma has brought her grandchild, the parents, neither of the parents has darkened the door of the church in 20 years, and the kid, you know that they go to the beach every Sunday morning, and you say, you know what? This is not right. This is not my understanding of what baptism is about. You have a right to say, no, I'm not going to officiate at this sacrament. Now, let's think about how that's going to play out. Somebody's not going to be happy, so don't do it in front of, announce it to your whole congregation in the announcements. You go to the parents and the grandparents privately and you explain your understanding of the sacrament and say, you know, you're not willing to do this. So you do have that freedom to not do something. You want to do it with a clear mind and an ability to explain why you're doing what you're doing.
And wouldn't the session also have that right to say no?
The session also has the right to say no. Yeah. State College has traditionally not only done weddings for people who are connected with the church simply because we're so close to campus. If we did it for everybody, there'd be 3 weddings every Saturday afternoon. Now, I wish the pastor had actually brought this to the session because the worship committee took a strong stand. We were remodeling the sanctuary. They were taking down the stained glass windows, which were falling out of their frames, and having them redone. And the mother of the bride heard that we were doing this, and she shrieked because it was going to ruin the pictures for her daughter's wedding. The view of the worship committee at State College was, tell her, hand her her deposit back and tell her, don't let the door hit you on the way out. The pastor compromised and took a $5,000 check from her so that they could pay to have the windows expedited. Wow. But frankly, worth it that much to have stained glass windows in your, anyhow, the session can say no. They're also...
Why would that have been a worship committee discussion at all? That's not the session, right?
The worship committee would have then reported it to the session. The worship committee, the session has authority over the timing of worship any worship services, or the holding. I mean, you want to hold an Ash Wednesday service, you want to hold a special service, memorial service for members who have died in the past year, you want to hold a 100th anniversary celebration, any special services, or even regular services. Session has authority over that. Session has authority over the decoration of the sanctuary, which is why this, in a big church, decisions usually get talked about in the committee, and then they make recommendations to the session, which acts. So that's why, good question, really good question, because it's not the pastor who gets to decide what time it is. He gets, or she gets to, as I said, choose the music, choose the scripture, choose the prayers, choose the hymns, but the order of worship goes to the session. The bulletin, you want to type it versus do it on a computer, that's the session decision. You want to know whether you can hang banners in the church, and you really want to get, I know we spent about 3 years, and who knows whether it's done yet, over whether the flag goes in the sanctuary and where. So whatever. What does the congregation, they're the people paying for all this. They get to elect officers. They are responsible for calling a pastor, for changing or terminating a call. Now, I'm being very specific. Leanne is a commissioned lay pastor. She is contracted with a session. But if you call a pastor, Ken's at Hollidaysburg, and they're calling a pastor, So that amount of cash salary will be determined by the congregation. Buying, mortgaging, and selling real property. This is one, you know, the congregation, you can't just, the session gets, when West Penn Power calls and says they'll give you $10,000 to run a transmission line over your parking lot, that goes to your whole congregation. Certainly, the session talks it over and decides whether that's a good thing to do. But if the session thinks it is a good thing to do, they can't just sign on the dotted line on their own. It needs to go to the congregation. When we closed the snowshoe church, this actually came up. Back in the 1940s, a trustee of the snowshoe church signed up with a coal company for $500 that they could dig on some property that Snowshoe owned. Well, they didn't dig. And they were to get 50 cents a ton for royalties. Well, in the 1940s, that would have been pretty good stuff. But it wasn't, they didn't start digging, mining that until the 1970s, when coal was $20 a ton and 50 cents royalty was not a good payment. But this guy had encumbered, they got lawyers, the paperwork's in my office. They got lawyers, and the lawyer said, you signed it, you didn't protest for 30 years, you're stuck. You don't want to have, you know, hopefully the trustee had long been dead and buried in the cemetery, because I wouldn't want to have the whole congregation saying, you gave away our rights for 50 cents a ton. It's a congregational authority.
The assumption is, I guess, that the congregation never voted on that?
Congregation never voted on that. I went back through their minutes, and I mean, that's what I've been told. Herb Call was really involved. He got Synod grants to have lawyers look into it, and you never want to stick your neck out alone, you know? Participating in joint congregational witness is in the Book of Order. I'm not quite sure what that is, frankly. But at any rate, congregations get involved with that, and adopting the bylaws. Those are the limited authorities of the congregation. You find those in the Book of Order in chapter G1, which, if you look at it, it's 19 to 24, so they're in the whole lot. And a lot of that is very appropriately what it takes to be a member of the church. What does the session do? Notice I got a whole bunch more. This, you find this in the beginning of chapter 3 of the Book of Order. The session governs the congregation. It guides its witness to God's activity. And those things under ensures, remember back when I started, how do we tell if we're being a good church? Well, the session, what it does is, the hallmarks are that the word is truly preached and heard, that the sacraments are rightly administered, that community is nurtured, that discipline is rightly maintained. It relates to other councils. The session is in charge of Christian education. So if you're using Christian education materials, your vacation Bible school person ought to go to the session and say, we're using the stuff from this publisher. The session should have a chance to take a look at it and approve it. That the word is truly preached and heard. Everyone, you folks are lay preachers. You will be the ones filling in when the minister or is not able to be present or a church doesn't have it. But the session is in charge of listening to you folks and see if you're really preaching the Word of God. If somebody comes out and is preaching snake oil, they have snake oil to heal, do healings and heal cancer, that the sessions should say, we're not going to have that person. Or the pastor shows up drunk in the pulpit. I haven't heard of that one lately. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard of that one here in this presbytery, but, it can happen. That the sacraments are rightly administered. I mean, I was chair of worship. It wasn't problems so much, but we had a worship lady who set up the communion trays, for whom it was really getting to be too much. And we as a session had to get together and say, I'm so sorry, but we are really grateful for the service you've given, but we're going to take this job and give it to somebody else. Not an easy or a pleasant thing, but it's your job as session to make sure that the sacraments are rightly set up. Presbytery. It's the authority of presbytery to create and dissolve congregations, to govern the church in its district. Those determines, trains, receives, disciplines, and dismisses those who will preach within its bounds. That's why presbytery is providing this training for you. It relates to other councils and ecumenical partners, like we're doing with West Kish. Ela Robertson is a Presbyterian, now minister, and she's half-time pastor at West Kish and half-time at St. John's Lutheran. So that's an ecumenical arrangement. We'll see how it works. In that governs its church in the district and creates and dissolves. These things work kind of, presbytery is kind of for your backstop. It was 14 years ago, Phillipsburg congregation came to us and told us that Glenn Eason had started his own church in Phillipsburg, half a mile from the Phillipsburg church. And he did this on his own without asking permission of COM or telling COM, either one. And he was doing it with members he had recruited from his former church at Osceola Mills. Now that was going to hurt at least two churches, Phillipsburg and Osceola. And so we said, you can't do that, Glenn, and remain a Presbyterian minister. If you want to do this, God bless you, but you can't do it claiming that you're a Presbyterian minister. That's one of the things about the discipline of the church. It is only moral persuasion. We can't go out and chop your head off. And we won't. We don't fine you. Well, you're going to see a picture that don't go. We used to do that. It's sad, but that's presbytery. Presbytery is the heart of it all. Chapter 3 will tell you who gets to be members of presbytery. Well, every session gets to be represented. Every session is allowed to and encouraged to choose a commissioner. They can choose them for one meeting at a time. They can choose them for a year at a time or whatever. But every session has a ruling elder member, and they don't have to be current currently serving on the session. They can be formerly people on the session, because you're ordained an officer for life. And every minister member of is a member of Presbytery, and then presbyteries are encouraged to make sure there is a balance between ruling elders and ministers of the Word and Sacrament, and to come up with a standard for usually it's additional elders. And in our case, we have said that commissioned lay pastors should be members of Presbytery for the duration of their commission. So Leanne, Ken, Janet are members of Presbytery. But they, like Ken, poor Ken, we call on you. He's our designated hitter, our pinch hitter. He's a member now. When Janie comes, he won't be. Presbytery has authority over congregation, over preaching of the word, over those who administer the sacraments. And you find that in G-30201. It's also supposed to be pastor to its ministers and its churches. So that means that when Roland Beeman was dying, Joy made sure she went and visited him. If somebody's in Danville and we can't make it, or Hershey and we can't make it there frequently, we'll ask people in Carlisle or Northumberland Presbytery to go and visit those people. Sam Strom, who is now living within the bounds of Redstone Presbytery, visits our folks who are in hospital in Pittsburgh because he's close there. We try to be pastoral. Presbyterian lay preachers, I figured that'd be of more interest to you than, say, Presbyterian Christian educators. Each presbytery sets the standards. The national denomination sets the standards for ministers of word and sacrament, but each presbytery sets the standards, determines the training, grants authority. If we look, the authorities that we can give you are to officiate at the Lord's Supper, to preach, moderate sessions, do funerals, what else have we done? But those things, those authorities come from Presbytery. Presbytery grants that authority. Presbytery maintains the accountability. That's why we say that you folks who have been here forever still have to come to this meeting. And the reason why, one of the reasons why, is that you folks, when you get together at breaks, you tell each other what you're doing, and if you are what you were doing is really out of line, one of your fellow elders is going to say, it's a little bit weird. I don't know about that. I mean, we had 8 or 9 years ago, one of our churches was between pastors, and they had a lay preacher filling in the pulpit, and the pulpit nominating committee stood up in church and, at the announcements time and said, you know, we're really happy, we're calling Pastor so-and-so, and we're really excited about him, and we want you to be excited. He'll be here to candidate in 3 weeks. And the lay preacher stood up afterwards and said, you folks don't need to call a pastor. You've got me. And Presbytery maintains accountability, and that person did not remain preaching, very long. We review and renew certification. That too that's part of the Book of Order. We do that for ministers too. Every year we believe in accountability. Okay. One of the ways we do keep accountable is standards. The Book of Order, the new Book of Order, which now isn't real new, it came in about 2012, it recommended that presbyteries establish policies. Policies are a really subordinate standard. They have, in our presbytery, we say they need they have to be published in the pre-presbytery packet, and they have to get a 2/3 vote. That's not Book of Order, but it is our manual. And we can provide policies on whatever we need. And your church, your session can. My church out in Oregon needed the policy on who used the china and the policy on who used and the coffee, because we had a Vietnamese custodian who was a Vietnamese who had formerly run a bar in Saigon before the end of the Vietnam War, and Nam made the best coffee in the world. It was strong. People came to our church for Nam's coffee. And we had a fellowship committee that wanted to provide coffee for as many events in the church as it could, and it provided watered down coffee. It was hot, it was black, sort of, but it didn't taste the same. There were, that was one of those things that in that church, there could have been a war, because there were the people who really didn't care about coffee or stopped at Starbucks on the way in, and there were the people who came for Nam's coffee. So we ended up with a policy. There will be the fellowship pitcher, there would be Nam's carafe, and there would be the hot water for the people who wanted tea. But that had to be, in that church, that policy needed to be there. And then the other one was the fellowship committee had its set of china that could go in the dishwasher, and the Women's Association had their nicer china that they used for wedding. Oh boy, and one went down one side of the closet, and the other was on the other side of the closet. And you did not want to be the person who picked up a teacup from the wrong side. Your church may have a problem with who gets to run the lawnmower because somebody keeps running it over stones. Or how early you turn on the furnace the day, on Saturday, and it may be tricky and you need a policy. Great. You do it. And that doesn't mean the fact that Leanne has a coffee policy doesn't make it required that Susan have it. Susan will need one for something else. At the presbytery level, we have training policies. If you look on the website, Susan has the lay preacher program, lay pastor program on the website. We have compensation and leave policies. Every June, you folks who come to presbytery, we vote on minimum terms of call, and we passed in our September revision of policies one that says what you folks get paid when you go to a church, $75 plus mileage. That makes it possible for folks like Jerry, who lives in Snowshoe, to be able to go to Milroy, which is a hefty distance. It's a lot harder for him to go to Milroy than it would be to go to Phillipsburg or Winburn. it's further away. Some of you are doing this because you have retired after good jobs, and you don't need, you're doing this simply for the love of it, and you don't need recompense. Others of you have also worked all your life very hard, but you do still need that in order to be able to answer God's call. After all, the Apostle Paul talked about being carried from one place to another. If he hadn't had somebody to carry him from one place to another after, well, we don't know what he had, a stroke, palsy, polio, whatever. If he hadn't had somebody to carry him from place to place, he couldn't have preached. We set standards for our churches so that you folks can fulfill your own calls. We also have various codes of conduct for former pastors. What is your behavior when you leave a church? Now, that's not the same thing as pulpit supply. If, and I'm using Jerry because I know where you go. You do go and preach and go, but you're not their pastor. So the former pastor's code of conduct would not apply to you once you stop preaching at Milroy. But when Leanne stops preaching at Mountaintop and to take care of those beautiful grandbabies, it would apply to her because she is a pastor. We have a computer usage policy. This one came up about a dozen years ago when we were suddenly hit with all sorts of things. When I was growing up, there were no laptop computers or computers with screens, and you probably didn't have them either. And there are a lot of things that parents and people have to worry about. There are a lot more ways of committing misconduct than we ever dreamed possible. So we started off with, okay, no pornography, no sexting or whatever that is. But we also found we had within our area folks who were using their office church computers to run personal businesses, which may or may not be illegal, but it certainly wasn't what we gave them the office computer for. There were people who were disregarding the laws on copyright to download the music for the Sunday worship without getting the appropriate permissions. And that is illegal, even though it's so easy to do. There are also one person in this presbytery to whom an organization gave the person, when they came, they said, this is your desk, this is your computer. Never dreaming that when that person left, he thought he took the computer with him.
He took the desk?
He didn't, apparently he didn't like the desk, but he took the computer with him. So we now have a computer policy that, at least at the presbytery, but you're all welcome to copy it, that makes clear that when we say, when you're given an office computer, it means for use of the office, it's not yours personally. And the second is, we learned from reading a magazine that comes out 5 times a year, Church Law and Tax Report. If you are worried about pornography, if you do not have a policy that says you, the employee, have no expectation of privacy, the session, if you walk in and see your pastor with pornography on her screen, you cannot dismiss her or whatever. So having policies sometimes helps.
Ginny, I have a question. These policies are
These are
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian.
So where do we find those? Because they're not in the book of order, right?
Nope, Susan.
We have, and we're working on the computer usage policy that
Oh.
needs
But
revised.
tell her
it's-
where they find these things.
well, I don't know that they're up on the internet right now because you're in the midst of creating them. Since we've had the reorganization, some of them aren't up to date yet. So they will be on the website.
But they're the Presbytery policy.
And they are the Presbyterian
Presbyterian
policies.
policies.
So we
And-
go to the Huntington.
One of the pages is policies and procedures and stuff,
Okay.
and that would be on there.
And when in doubt, call Susan, call me, call Joy. We'll connect you, even if they aren't. Janet tells me that it is time for a break, so we're stopping right there. 10 minutes. In the Book of Order about making a disabled pastor a pastor emeritus. And I remember I called my buddy Mark Tammon again, and Mark said, "Oh, Ginny, sin bold." Sin bold. So you can get away with breaking our polity a little bit here or once in a while there, but if you are consistently stepping beyond the bounds, you're in trouble. Seek to follow Jesus Christ in your own life. 50 years ago, you could not be a divorced pastor, divorced minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, even if it was your spouse who had totally abandoned you and run off. We don't go there anymore, but still, if you are a habitual drunkard, if you are abusing drugs, if you are cheating on your spouse, that is not following Jesus Christ in your own life. If you are dipping your hand into the congregational till. And heaven knows there was just a story in the paper in the last month about
The Belmont
Belmont Lutheran Church. It happens. That's why we have accountability and participate actively in government and discipline. You folks already are. But we point out, Joy and I point out to some of our ministers who say, "I'm too busy to come to Presbytery or participate." We will point out that when they want and seek their next call, that the reference checks come to us, and we will be saying, "No, they are not a good presbyter." Church and civil law, I'm just pointing this out. This is chapter 4 of the Book of Order. If your church is getting involved, if you're selling property, financial trusteeship, people who have abused sexual conduct, and that can be adult on adult, child molestation, child abuse, that's where you find the statements in the Book of Order about that. Hopefully, you never have to look at that, but it's there. Church and property. The litmus test is that property is considered a tool for the accomplishment of the mission of Jesus Christ in the world. If you are leasing property, the congregation, the session, and the presbytery all get involved. If you are a small church, you may very well have someone who is forming a new congregation or even an old congregation that their space is no longer available or appropriate for their needs, and they may approach you and ask you if they could lease your church. this is where you want to get Presbytery involved, because we want to make sure that you can still use your property as a tool for the accomplishment of the mission of Jesus Christ in the world. And it may well be that you use your church on Sunday morning and this group wants to use it on Sunday afternoon, and it would be a win-win for everybody. But if they say, we're going to give you so much a month, and we get the church, every day, morning and afternoon, except for Saturday evening, we're going to say, no. Think about it. That money sounds good and it will fix the roof, but if it fixes your roof and you no longer get to be the people of God, it's not worth it. And that's where we hold each other accountable. Sexual misconduct, unfortunately, thanks to Jerry Sandusky, we deal with this a lot. You'll find that we start with, where's our authority to tell you and your congregations how they must behave? Well, it's under the gifts and qualifications for ministry in the second chapter, G-20104. Definition of sexual abuse in the church is anybody who uses their power in the church over someone with less power. That is sexual abuse. And unfortunately, 100 years ago, it was the done thing that a young male pastor came out of seminary, and he was supposed to, and it was a he was supposed to find his wife in his first congregation. We don't do that anymore.
We don't arrange marriages, is that what you mean?
We don't arrange marriages. And we say, if you are pastor, you inherently have power over the members of your congregation. For one thing, they take a vow, and when you're installed, that they will listen to and abide by your teachings. That in itself gives an unequal power. And so what we tell the young pastor, male or female, who comes out of seminary and starts being attractive, even if it's to a unattached person of the opposite sex, we say, if you're going to have a relationship with so-and-so, either you or they have to leave this church temporarily and go worship someplace else. So that your authority is not unequal.
Has it always been that way, Jenny, or is that a more recent?
That's that's very recent. It's as society's understanding of of power and of abuse.
Now, what if there's a known sexual offender among the congregation?
Yes. And we have had this. This is where we start with, if they want to work with children. You start by saying, we're going to test everybody in the who's going to work with the kids has to get the 3 clearances. If they are already a registered sex offender, that will catch them. But beyond that, if you know that there is someone who is a convicted sexual offender, and they want to worship in your congregation, you start with the understanding that nobody has the right to worship in your church. That's a hard thing because we want to reach out, we want to be forgiving. Science tells us that sexual predators, many of them cannot change. your session needs to have a closed session meeting at which you may bring in someone from your community who's involved in that field. ANR is a fabulous resource for us all. And frankly, the best thing is to say, no, they cannot worship in your congregation, that you will send an elder, team of two. Could be an elder and a pastor, or 2 elders, or an elder and a deacon, to visit and visit in their home and take them the sacraments, take them the Word of God, pray with them. If they are going to be in your church, you have to set up a protocol with that there will be an accompanier with that individual every minute, including them going to the restroom.
I have a question that.
Yeah.
So, I'm in Terry's congregation, and as the father of 3 young boys, I'm kind of wondering where that question came from, number one. And number two, is there some sort of policy that the church is going to alert me as the father of 3 young boys that there will be a sex offender in my congregation? Because that's something I really want to know.
I know my grandson is being raised in the Catholic faith, and he's an altar boy, and I've told my daughter, if some priest touches my kid, yeah,
Okay.
grandma will be there. So, yeah, okay.
All
Now,
questions aside, I mean, I'm being
That's
dead
right.
serious.
Your
Will the
kids-
church, is there some sort of policy that the church is going to alert me that there is a sex offender amongst the congregation?
there should be. That's why I say you're gonna have a session meeting, and hopefully have somebody, somebody like ANR or social worker side of it, or somebody who's a law enforcement side, who's come and talked to you, and your session better come up with a policy. And that's why I say the best policy is to say, no, you cannot worship in our, we will accept you as a member, but we will take the worship to you rather than you coming to us.
With all due respect, Jenny, that's the second time you said that, and I personally cannot agree with that stance.
Okay?
I mean,
Tell us why.
I just, when you said science tells us that people that have committed sexual offenses, proclivity to do it again. I mean, you could also argue that science tells us that people that embezzle money would have a proclivity to do it again. People that would cheat on their spouse would have a proclivity to do it again. Scripture tells me that, through the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, the repentance of the believer, that that there is no sin that is too great that Jesus can't forgive and that he can't save. Now, based on that, that doesn't mean that we should, just the concern that how do we handle that person? Do we have policies to what certainly we need policies. We certainly need, and I think that one of those policies could be, and I'm not suggesting this is right, I'm just suggesting, one of those policies could be that person would need to stand before the congregation and actually, to say, I did this and I was convicted of this and I would like to worship with you and I believe in Jesus and I believe, I've repented my sin, and that might be your policy. But to me, for you to say that the best policy is to not allow that person to worship, I mean, that's not how I read the scripture. I'm not suggesting you're wrong and I'm right, I'm just suggesting I can't agree with that.
I think Todd's view is very valid, and not only that, even if I disagreed with it, that view is going to be out there in the congregation, and this is why, as we say, the session gets paid the big bucks to make these decisions. So session is in charge, and the session has to listen to Todd's view, he has to listen to my view, he has to listen to the concerns over here.
But there, okay, so more
So,
back.
and I think, yes, make a policy, and I encourage you in this case to bring in the professionals to help you.
Two instances, I became aware because I was in education, and we are encouraged to check the Megan's list on a rather regular basis because you don't know who is around the school. And just to make yourself aware, you have to remember that people can be placed on the Megan's list for a number of different things, which my son, who is a state trooper, continually reminds me. But I found as an educator that one of the folks that was attending our special events at my one church was on that list. I couldn't get any additional information because they were on the list from out of state. When I went to the pastor at that time, they were unaware. So I let the pastor know. I also called Joy. And what we did was basically we had a few folks who could keep confidential information and made sure that at any time that person was attending a function, they were not a regular member of the church, they were not coming on a regular Sunday basis, but they would come to special events. That any time that that person was there, that they were basically accompanied by one of these watchers. It seemed to work fairly well. It was amazing after I became the commissioned lay pastor how many people in the congregation were aware of this person's past history. The person is not worshiping, is not living in the area right now. A second incident that I had, I am a member, actually the president and the secretary of the ministerium, and we are open to all denominations. We encourage, we really work together. We are very unusual, I guess, as a ministerium that we work together. But we had some folks show up the one Sunday, or the one meeting, and basically told all of our pastors how horrible and awful they were because they had been thrown out of 3 churches because of the actions of the one person in the couple who was active on a list and had actually violated their probation and had been sent back to jail and was basically told they were not welcome in the Sunday service. And these people went on and started their own church and wanted to come to our ministerium to tell us how awful we were and that they had their own church and that they would be accepting people who were thrown out of the local denominations. So every case is going to be a little bit different. I would encourage you to check on the Megan's list, the Megan's Law list. You will find that an awful lot of those folks in this area probably are on the list. They're either in SCI Rockview or they're on SCI Houtsdale. If they are incarcerated, I don't think that's an issue, but you might want to check the list. So.
I mean, I think we have to recognize that we, as the body of believers, are in many ways, and this isn't just a sexual crime or sexual sin discussion. I mean, you know, there are people who very sadly physically abuse a child or physically abuse an adult or, you know, commit murder or, you know, lots of other crimes that none of us are you know, that we would all raise our hackles, right? You know, but I mean, when any criminal sinner ultimately, if they were to come to Christ in true repentance and seek, true forgiveness, we're the only body of people in the world that can potentially accept that person and forgive them and have any assurance that that person would be forgiven. If you think about it, I saw an article a year ago or so. It was a young man up the mountain who had shook a baby and the baby died or something like that. It's a terrible thing, a terrible thing. But, if that young man were to read the Bible, come to Christ, ask for forgiveness, there's nobody in his hometown that's probably going to forgive him for that, or that the mother's family or his family or whatever. But we as the body of believers, we're the only people that in hearing that confession, in that repentance of accepting that person, we're the only people that could really show love and forgiveness to that person. Because nobody else in our society is going to do that. He's not going to get forgiven by anybody else other than believers. That's my perspective on it. And the same thing as it relates to these other issues, if it's I guess I'm enough of a sinner myself, and after, through God's grace, being forgiven, I think, how can I withhold my love, my forgiveness for somebody that's done something different than I've done?
Whoa, Janet?
I think one of the main things that we're considering here is the habitual offender, that we need to protect our children and we're not talking about a one-time deal where you got mad and did something. We're talking about somebody who is a habitual offender. How do we protect our children in our churches or our elders or, and yes, there are extreme measures that do need to be taken.
Okay, I'm going to move this along because this class is about the polity. These are serious issues. Every one of the opinions that's been lifted up and statements made is absolutely on target. In the Presbyterian Church, in the polity of the Presbyterian Church, it's the session, and this is where you can be helpful. You can be helpful in saying, don't stick this under a rug, face this, discuss what all of these opinions.
And we need a policy.
And you need we cannot make a global policy because, as Leanne said, these are going to be different. I'm going to finish up on polity and say, again, session. And then I was also asked to talk a little bit about Robert's Rules of Order, and we will do that. But in summary, the polity of the Presbyterian Church, we do things by ordered groups. Think of school kids skipping down the hallway holding hands. We do things by groups. We are connectional. That means Leanne's ministerium is a great thing, because if you are going to be a pastor, who else knows the problem? You need somebody. I need somebody as the stated clerk. I go to every fall polity conference and we sit together and say, can you believe what my churches did? And it's so wonderful to have somebody else say, yeah. And you as pastor, whether you're a Catholic priest or an independent Church of God, they got congregants. They got people who do or do not listen to their sermons. We are orderly. We don't rush out and do things. We have unity in our diversity. So we need to welcome folks who are sinners, recognizing we all are. And we treat everybody, again, as Todd was saying, we got to treat people with respect and dignity. Now, it seems to me, Leanne's, the people who started their own church of sinners, they were not treated with respect and dignity, but they were coming to the ministerium, not treating the ministerium. They were returning lack of respect and dignity. So, It worked. All right, going to see if we can come up. That stupid, it's right where I want to hit. I hope that, yeah, okay, now, final, open parliamentary process. Our book of order says that we use Robert's Rules of Order. Basically, there is no church in this presbytery in which you need to be an expert at Robert's Rules of Order. But Robert's Rules of Order, the principles on which Robert's Rules of Order are based are very similar to the principles we hold there in Chapter 3 of the Foundation. So if you, who may well be moderating a session, have principles of Robert's Rules of Order in your own mind, you will help guide your session without making it formal in appropriate ways. And as I say, remember, you don't have to know everything. You just have to know a little more than they do. The mission statement for Robert's Rules of Order is that the great lesson for democracy to learn is for the majority to give to the minority a full, free opportunity to present their side of the case. And then, for the minority, having failed to win a majority to their views, gracefully to submit and recognize that action as that of the entire organization, and cheerfully to assist in carrying it out until they can secure its repeal. Now, if you're an elder and they vote that we're going to remodel the kitchen and we're going to put in floor tile and you wanted industrial carpeting, you don't get to go home and say, I'm not showing up for the workday. The basic end of Rules of Order is regard for the rights of the majority. The majority of people want floor tile. They have a right to have floor tile. Of the minority, particularly a strong minority, gotta let them be heard. The fact that you want the bid is only good for 2 weeks doesn't mean you get to not hold a session meeting which wasn't scheduled for 3 weeks. You call a special session meeting. The rights of individual members. Everybody gets to speak. What are the rights of absentees? And indeed, of the whole together. And why? What are these for? They're to protect against instability. If you come to your session in January and you vote to hold church at 10:30 in the morning, and there are people who don't like it, and the next meeting it comes back and they decide to hold it at 10, and the next meeting it's at 11, and then the next meeting you're still debating it and you're back to 10:30. You're wasting the time, the energy, and goodwill of your session members. So Robert's Rules of Order is trying to enable the assembly to arrive at the general will on the maximum number of questions in the minimum amount of time. You also have the people who, I know them, I'm probably one of them, who make a report and say, I make the motion that we buy industrial carpeting, and then tell you, they're still talking 30 minutes later. You want to be able to get through and go home and watch the ball game.
You're not supposed to say I make a motion anyway. It's I move.
You're probably right, but it's okay.
I know. But as somebody who has studied parliamentary procedure, it just gets on my nerves.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't come to my
Take a pill, Terry.
what makes something, to consider yourself able to make decisions, you have to have a group of people. First of all, it's a group. It's not the pastor and one trustee meeting on Wednesday afternoon, who have the freedom to act together. People are not there, who are not coerced to be there, who engage in a full, free discussion. It's not the minister says, I want to baptize this baby, all in favor say, no, you got to be able to discuss it. Who can decide on a course of action for the whole group. No parking lot discussions. If two elders go out after the session meeting and decide in the parking lot they're going to do something different, that's not what Rainey means. Conditions. This is changing, but actually Robert's Rules of Order, if you know somebody who's got the most recent edition, it has a really good summary of, in this technological age, what does it mean to have a meeting? I mean, it's actually brilliant. You have to meet together either in a single space or with simultaneous oral communication among all participants. That means a telephone, if you have somebody who's home with a broken leg in the session that you really want to be part of, you can telephone them in. You can Skype them in. What you cannot do and call it appropriate is an email poll. Now, when we had, if you do things like an email poll, what you do is you say, this decision would be tentative, it has to be confirmed by the next regular meeting. I consider that okay. But you don't want to do, that should be done only on a pro forma thing, like there is a tornado or a hurricane in the middle of the week and you want to take an offering to help the people out. And you know you don't, this happens on Thursday afternoon and you don't really have time to have a session meeting on, get the people together on Saturday to approve it. So you do an email poll. And then on Sunday morning, right before service, you grab the elders and say, okay, everybody still in favor of this? That's okay. That's a very simple, you're either going to have it or you're not going to have it. You don't want to have the discussion of the alternative Christian education curriculums for Vacation Bible School as an email poll, because people are going to have opinions and want to discuss that. And they may want to say, instead of buying 25 copies of the curriculum, I move we buy 3 and each teacher can photocopy. Now you're getting into amendments, and email is not, everybody doesn't simultaneously get that email. You open up your email at different times. So if you're going to do anything other than a telephone, you can telephone, Skype in, anything that has oral, which means your ears. You don't have to be able to see them. Those are okay under any conditions, but mail, no. Participants. It seems obvious. Participants are folks who have the right to participate. Those with that right are free to act according to their own judgment. But I actually had just in the last 2 years, one of our churches was doing a remodeling program, a big remodeling program, and they currently didn't have any trustee on the session who was really good at that, but they did have a former trustee in the congregation who was a really good project manager, engineer. And so they made him the head of the committee to supervise this. That's fine. But what wasn't fine was that they had him coming to every session meeting and giving him vote as well as voice. You can't do that. You can give the person who's not on session the responsibility to head that task. You can invite him to your session meeting and have him give all the reports and speak, but he does not have the right to vote. The other is that folks with that right are free to act according to their own judgment. We emphasize when folks become commissioners to presbytery or to synod or to general assembly, you are a commissioner. You are to listen for the will of God. You are encouraged to get the opinions from your own community of faith. But when you get there, you listen to the Holy Spirit, you listen to the voices around you, and you vote your conscience. Now, I wanted to show this because somebody said, what about chopping off the heads? 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I was privileged to go on a Reformation tour, and this is the Limmat River in the heart of Zurich, Switzerland, where they Huldrych Zwingli was the leader of the Reformation there. And right along here, in the early 1500s, the Anabaptists were also very active. The Reformation was a whole lot, it was not one guy's thought and everybody agreed with it. The Mennonites are the people who are our Amish today. This is their tradition. They did not believe, as they studied the Reformation, studied the scriptures, they did not believe in child baptism. Zwingli and Calvin and Luther did believe in child baptism, and there were more of Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin than there were of Anabaptists. And what happened was a guy named, named Felix Manz, M-A-N-Z, in 1527, was drowned in the Limmat River under the instigation of Huldrych Zwingli because he wouldn't agree to child baptism. So they drowned him.
It's the ultimate baptism.
It was. January, they chopped a hole in the ice and they threw him in at that very spot. He was not able to participate freely in the discussion because they were essentially, they dragged him, they were using poles to drag him off and drown him. That's not what you would call a deliberative assembly.
So we're not allowed to do that?
We're not, no, and there are certainly people that,
I was just checking.
yeah, unfortunately, no.
I got some session members.
Yeah, I do too. Oh, yeah,
A little drowning would be good fun.
We need a little levity.
we do. Also, one person, one vote. And if some of this sounds like our political system, John Witherspoon was one of our folks who helped write first books of order, and he also was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. And there were a lot. Presbyterians have always been involved in society, so there were Presbyterians involved in setting up our government. One participant, one vote, equal weight. The other part, those whose side prevails assume responsibility for the decision. To me, it's why when I see stories or commentaries or whatever, new discussions about the idea that and this is true, that a lot of people in society are not actually becoming members of churches. People tend to float in and out, and how do we make use of these people's talents? I don't want people making decisions. My personal opinion is I don't want people making decisions who aren't going to be around to carry them out, who have made no commitment to carrying them out. So if you have people who come in and say, we should remodel the sanctuary so we can have a praise band, and they come in and they made the decision, and then they're worshiping in the Lutheran church next week. We can't have a decision to go ahead and do what they wanted. They're not going to be there to support it. So if your session makes a decision to whatever, and you're on that session, you're responsible to help carry it out. The other thing is to remember, another thing is losing is not sin. Failure to concur or vote for a decision of the body is not equivalent to leaving the body, nor results in expulsion. So when, you may choose to leave, you have that right always. We are a voluntary society. You have the right to leave, but if you didn't vote to raise the pastor's salary, you don't get thrown out. You don't get told that you're a bad person for not voting for a raise in the pastor's salary. But you have lost, but that's it. You just, at one vote, you move on to the next one. Absentees, we rather already talked about this, but this is, again, in Robert's Rules of Order. The voice and votes of those present act for the whole. When McAlevy's Fort was leaving, one of the things they needed to do was clean their rolls, and they eventually did, but they asked us, can we have the people at nursing homes vote? And we said, we're very sorry, but no, they're not present. Those people who come are the people who get to make the vote. So foundational principles, we seek together to find the will of Christ, and that means being in the same place. This hopefully can go pretty fast, but the moderator is in charge. The moderator allocates the floor. The moderator determines who gets to speak. The moderator sees that you discuss one item of business at a time. The last probably is the one that may be hard. You started discussing when you're going to have baptism, because you're also tearing apart the sanctuary for the summer to get cleaning and refinish the pews. And suddenly somebody else wants to talk about, they remembered the bad experience somebody had with the paint on their sanctuary. You as the moderator are supposed to gently say, folks, that's a really important issue, but that's not what we're talking about right now. One item of business at a time, one person at a time. The role of a moderator, is to keep things moderate, keep control of the assembly, and by that, keep people from, you don't want people throwing things or stomping out. Make sure everybody gets heard. All of you have been on sessions where you have the guy who thinks and listens and only speaks up after he's heard several other people speak, or maybe doesn't speak at all because he says, my view was already heard. Or you have, and it's usually a woman, who was raised in a very traditional family, who she doesn't feel that it's right for her to speak because other people know better. Both of those people were elected by the congregation to be elders. The congregation and the nominating committee saw they had gifts for ministry. So doggone, you want to hear from them. So after you've heard from Loudmouth Ginny and Paul, who knows the answer to everything, if you're the moderator, you say, okay, we've heard from Ginny and Paul. Janet, what do you think? John, what do you think? Let's hear your voices too. Deliberately bring those people in. If you have somebody on it who's conference calling in, be sure you bring in. We've got Mary on the phone. Mary, what do you think? Or the Skype person. Make sure everybody gets heard. Then make sure everybody knows what they're voting on. You started out talking about whether you were holding a baptism during the summer when the pews were being refinished, and you segued over into the bad paint. Make sure everybody knows that what you're voting on is the baptism. Be neutral when moderating. The body should not know the moderator's stance. Grady, yeah, you've got, and I'm showing, this is another picture from my Reformation trip. This is called in French, it's auditoire, and it actually means auditorium. It's the building next door to the cathedral that John Calvin preached in Geneva, and it's a beautiful building still did. He held Bible studies every morning during the week. Don't you think that he could figure out a way to get his opinion on whatever across in the middle of the Bible study, so that by the time he got to the session meetings, he didn't have to say, anybody who votes no on that, you as moderator have a whole lot of ways and tools at your disposal so people know what you think. Remember we talked about your way of life should imitate Christ? Well, if you're living the right way, if you're reading Sunday school material, if you're focusing on parables in your preaching, they're going to get the idea that the Sunday school curriculum that does parables might well be a good one, You have plenty of opportunities. So the other thing about being a moderator and not letting people know what your opinion is, in the situation where you're voting on things, you are, even though we emphasize that people have the right to be free in their choices, even though we say losing is not sinful, it hurts to lose a vote. You don't want to give the people who are at your session table the sense that you are for the people who vote whatever way. You want to continue to be the pastor of everybody at that table. And when you come out strongly by saying, I really think the only way to go is against this, you've just said to the people who are for it, I'm not your pastor. And you want to avoid that.
Hey, Ginny, I would like to make a suggestion that, of course, there's a lot of things that drive me crazy about not following parliamentary procedure, but one of the things that I see most common that would make it easier for a moderator to moderate a meeting smoothly and everybody to know what you're voting on and so on, is that no discussion starts until a motion is made. And so when there's a motion, then somebody says, I move that we do this. You could be for or against it. It doesn't, even the person making the motion could be for or against the motion. That, though, starts the discussion and allows the moderator to say, now remember, people, this is the motion on the floor. This is what we need to focus our discussion on. Let's bring it back to the motion that's on the table.
Okay, and she's absolutely right, and this brings up, how do you make sure this happens? Because what happens, you sit down at the table and somebody says, we're here to discuss what we're gonna do with the parking lot. And everybody's talking, and the moderator can say, folks, good discussion, it needs to happen, but first of all, we need a motion. Property chair, would you please make a motion? Then we can debate it, and you folks can amend it, but let's get a motion on the floor so we know what we're talking about.
And really, that's where, in parliamentary procedure, you know, if that group is not prepared to move and vote on a proposed action, that's really where referring it to a committee becomes, you know, that discussion.
Just, he's so right, but you guys, you're taking it out of my,
Are we stealing your thunder?
if you're stealing my thunder.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we start here. First thing, moderator recognizes somebody to speak. You know, only one person. Make a motion, requires a second. The reason it requires a second is, hey, we don't do things all by ourselves. We, you know, if you want to make a motion, we need to know at least 2 people think this should be discussed. Allow the maker to speak to the motion, and you can set time limits if you know this person will talk for the rest of the meeting. Debate. The moderator restates the motion so that you know what we're voting on. You take a vote and declare the results. Simplest things you come up with, and again, keep these in the back of your mind. You don't have to be real formal, but you need to know what it should be. A maker moves an amendment, again, it requires a second. Maybe you're changing time of worship from 10:30 to 10, and somebody says, what about 10:15? Well, then you discuss only on the amendment. You debate, the moderator restates the amendment, you take a vote. These come up all the time. Friendly amendments. An amendment may be friendly in its intent, but there is no parliamentary process for friendly amendments. If you think something is not quite right, make a regular amendment. Don't just say, I'm sure the maker of the amendment meant. Well, that person may or may not have, and how can they protest? And then you're going to get into a discussion, but it won't have even been made. So if somebody wants to make a friendly amendment, again, you as a moderator said, how about you make that as a real amendment? It can cause confusion and hard feelings. Then we're getting back to what Todd said. Maybe they're not really ready. I mean, for example, in last fall at State College, somebody who was on the finance committee said, hey, the people across the road at Panera Bread wanted to know if they could use 3 spaces in our parking lot next to the church on weekends to fill their trucks so they can take them off to sell them to the people at football games. And then we realized that the property people knew that there were some legal implications to this, and the mission people were saying, oh, we've already had this mission program gearing up that the youth group was going to staff, I mean, they were going to sell parking spaces for the football weekend to make money for their mission trip. So you have these people who all have good ideas, but as you said, they're not really ready, they're not ready for prime time. So there are a couple options here, we'll show them. One is to postpone. We're all going to go back and think about this and figure it out because we don't have all the information. basically an amendment. It requires a motion to postpone. It requires a second. When is this useful? When your information is not really, you don't have the information. It's not one you should use when everybody has the information and they're just madder than hell. Another one is refer. If you know that there is a group in the church that has specific information, then you refer it to that committee. It's debatable, and when is it useful? When you want to get some specific information. Maybe you're doing a remodeling project and you all agree that the bathroom has to be fixed, but nobody has gone out to the plumber yet to find a plumbing supply to find out what it costs. And so you refer. Calling the question. This is pretty esoteric. Robert's Rules of Order doesn't like people shouting out, call for the question, but it is legitimate in our sessions. What you do need to know is that it requires a vote on itself. Person raising their hand saying, I call the question, that doesn't call the question. That's simply, hey, is anybody out there? It needs a second. It needs a vote. And it's only on calling the question. The other part is the moderator can choose not to accept a motion. And that's one. If you're debating whether you're going to, you've got $10,000 and you're going to use it either to replace the roof or to repair the kitchen, and everybody has opinions on it, and one person has spoken, and everybody else still has their opinion that hasn't been voiced, the moderator can say, Jerry, I think this body really needs to debate this. There's some views that haven't been expressed. When it is time to cease debate, I will call on you and let you make the motion to call the question. Use tact, but you have the authority as moderator to say, I think I won't accept that motion at this time.
So let's call the question.
Call the question is where somebody says, oh my gosh, we've been talking about this for a while and I think we've heard every opinion there possibly could be, let's vote.
Okay, gotcha.
And if that is true, then the body will vote to close debate, call the question. If it is not true, if the body still has things that it feels it wants to do. Now, you as moderator, you're also realizing that while they're doing the discussion on whether we're going to fix the roof or the kitchen, you also have some really important decisions to make, about whether we use grape juice or wine for the communion or whatever. There's more on the docket. You as the moderator can say, folks, I know you're still interested in this topic, but we've got 10 other items of business and we'd really like to get out of here. And you just kind of test the water. You as moderator test the water. You don't dogmatically say, unless you have a order of the day, you say, folks, do you think you're ready to vote? And your body will tell you whether they're ready to vote or, if it's just one person who's going on and on and on, they will never say they're ready to vote. But if the rest of the body are going. When it's done, once the session has voted, the item is over. keep on discussing requires a vote to reconsider. The session should not be held hostage by a losing individual. This will take some courage on the part of you as a moderator, because the people who lost and want to keep talking will have to be squelched, and that's kind of hard. It should be done. And it's not, it should be done. We had one of our churches ended up with Joy and me and Sam and a couple other people, I mean, to deal with this one. The church had, we're going to rotate it among the trustees. The discussion on the Sunday school curriculum is over. It's done. Thank you.
Well, okay, but say that church the following year wanted to reconsider.
That's perfectly fine.
Well, if the decision
It
was,
won't be a reconsideration. By then, after a passage of a year, that's a new motion.
okay.
So
So
that's-
even if that session said, from now on, for all eternity, we're never doing Handel's Messiah again, you're saying that the session the following year could bring it up as a brand new
I am
motion
indeed.
and readdress
Yes.
it? Okay.
Yes, but we're not going to do it at every session
Session meeting
meeting.
until Christmas, sure.
Yeah.
Well, actually, you are, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
And in the
exactly.
parking lot and.
In the
Yeah.
parking lot and at the Denny's and everywhere else, yeah.
Exactly. Voting tips. This is just, like, when I read this, voice votes tend to favor male voices. I hadn't thought about that, but male voices are lower in the auditory spectrum, so they project. So if you think you've got, there were yes, ayes, and nays, and you wonder, okay, take a hand vote. It's just real simple. You just say as moderator, I'm not really sure it was divided, let's count. It's simple. It doesn't embarrass anybody or threaten anybody. You just say, when in doubt, divide the house. Moderators should not vote unless the motion is performed. If you're voting to approve the minutes, sure. If you're voting to close the meeting at the end, sure. If you're voting on anything that's controversial, no, don't vote. You have the right to vote, you don't have to exercise it. Keep a few paper ballots, pieces of blank pieces of paper you can quickly tear up. If it's really, really controversial, do a written ballot. And then you as moderator do get to vote, because nobody will know what your vote is.
Does the moderator not have an obligation to vote in the event of a tie?
Yes. Although they can choose not, they can still say, I choose not to vote, in which case the motion loses. But the moderator does have that, and that happened to me once in Miami Presbytery, when they came down to the Presbytery budget and whether they were going to fund Planned Parenthood. And I thought, oh, Lord. But I was ready, so at least I knew there was going to be a possibility of something like that. Oh, well. But so preparation, if you are a moderator, look at the agenda ahead of time. Think about your cast of characters. You'll know your cast of characters. You know what are their hot button topics. Be prepared. Just like, as I said, have some blank ballots on hand. If it's going to be somebody's going to challenge you on Robert's Rules of Order, even though you don't really use those in your meeting, you look up Robert's Rules of Order. If you notice, I always have this sitting in front of me on the table. It makes people think I know.
That's recorded now, Jenny,
Yeah,
sorry.
you know, you keep a Bible in front of you. They will think you know where everything is in the Bible.
Do you want me to delete that part from here?
Electronic voting. This is a policy that folks need. We just finally got around to approving one, but for the future, if your church is going to do things, anything electronically, like email polls or whatever, you're going to need to think about it and put it in your bylaws. Robert's Rules of Order has some suggestions. You can also probably find them online. Special, if you are really going to do lots of your meetings, and I don't think any of us are, but you would need to put in special rules for quorum and what notice is and how you make amendments. Basically, I think telephoning somebody in, conference calling somebody in, Skyping somebody in is reasonable in our context. Why would we need to do all electronic voting? I mean, it defeats the sense of community anyway. But it's legitimate if you follow the rules. Parking lot conversations. Parking lot conversation is where your session meets, or your deacons meet, or even your congregation meets, and they discuss whatever issues, and they make decisions on them, and then 2 or 3 folks go out in the parking lot afterwards and say, I don't like that. What do you do? What can we do about, how do you avoid this? How do we, what can you do about these? And I'm throwing this open.
Certainly, if you're moderating the session, or even if you're just on that session, and you go through a...
In the last 5 years, where a very tricky situation came up, and one of the elders felt so aggrieved and so hurt that he got up and walked out of the meeting. And the pastor, I thought, did a very intelligent and off-the-cuff thing, but he said to the rest of the session, I gotta go speak. We're gonna arrest this meeting, go to the bathroom, sit and talk. I'll be back, but I need to go out. John is hurting. I'm gonna follow him out. Pastor went out, affirmed his understanding that the individual's hurt, and said, you have every right to march out of this meeting, and if you never come back, that's your decision. But right now, you are a member of the session, and the rest of the session need to hear your hurt and your feelings and your understanding of this situation. Will you please come back with me into the session meeting, and we will finish this conversation together, and then you can do whatever you need to do. And I thought that was also a very, in a way, it was a good parking lot discussion, because the pastor was affirming the hurt, affirming the validity of those feelings, but also drawing the person back in. Or it could be if you're taking the controversial decision over which project you're going to fund or defund, and it's controversial, to say, folks, before we take this vote, we're going to pray, like Todd suggested, but also when we're done, this is an important decision. We need to be able to go out, and whatever the decision is, we will all agree, we will help carry it out. And if you're not ready to make this decision at this time, we can postpone this vote. So there are a number of things you can do.
Ginny, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but I think there's a possibility that the moderator could be hurt in a discussion or in a vote as well. The person moderating the meeting could feel a personal attack or take it personally when it's not intended that way. But anyway, who does the moderator turn to when they're feeling hurt by a discussion or a vote?
The moderator says, the moderator can say something along, I mean, if it's a vote, the moderator can say, if you disagree with the ruling, disagree with the ruling of the moderator, you have the right to ask for a motion of whether or not the ruling of the moderator should be sustained. So there's that. If they challenge, say, I don't think that, challenge your ruling. When I arrived here, Ann Ard was moderating. And at our first meeting, we were discussing the budget. And there was one mission of the Presbytery. We had sent out to all the mission groups that the Presbytery had supported and said, what are your needs for next year? What have you done? What are your needs for next year? And so on. And one of the groups sent a rather abrupt notice saying, we're too busy to tell you what we've done. We want so many $1,000. And they refused to tell us what they had done. And we defunded them or cut their budget. And someone stood up on the floor of Presbytery and got very upset and really was attacking the moderator. She said, Ann just looked at him and said, I'm sorry, I'm calling. You must address your remarks to the moderator and not to the body, and please be respectful. And the person went, oh. So those are the two. I mean, you as moderators say, we will hold things up and we will speak respectfully of folks of all opinions. And B, they can you say, okay, you really feel, and it's always, shall we sustain the ruling of the chair? It's always phrased positive toward the chair. So they have the right to overrule you, but at least it reduces the level of tension, hopefully. This is the other one, outsiders. Yeah?
We have a situation on our session. My husband and I are both elders, and we sit on session. And we voted on a situation, and we thought it was okay, and apparently one of our outsiders did not think it was okay. They were very angry, and they called my husband and reamed him out and whatever. But then he went and sent an email to every elder, trustee, deacon, everybody in the church saying, in essence, calling us liars. And what do you do?
When they call and they criticize it, you say, please refer that to the moderator.
Yeah.
And the session may then, if the person has gone ahead and spread dissension, the session may very well put it on their docket. How do we handle this?
Right.
What should, we will make a statement as the session, our view is X, and this is what we meant by it, and we want people to be respectful of one another. When I put outsiders, I'm actually thinking, well, outsiders would count as the person you're describing, but when Broad Avenue and First Presbyterian in Altoona merged, they eventually chose that they were going to use the Broad Avenue facility, which meant that the First church property wasn't being used, and the church, the merged church set up a task force to decide what they were going to do with it, and they hadn't quite come up with they were heading toward getting rid of, divesting themselves of the property, but they hadn't gotten it, but they were doing what they needed to do. A completely outside group with a fairly bombastic individual, I know, because he came to my office and he outweighed me by a ton. But this person came to the session meeting, total outsider, not a member of the church, and tried to harangue and harass and threaten the session into selling, or giving, rather, selling for $1, giving the property to him and his organization, and threatening the church, the session, that he would go to the civic authorities in Altoona and have them do all sorts of harassment inspections and changing their tax, property tax levels, and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And fortunately, they had a really good clerk who stood up and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you don't have a right to speak." But it was harassing. So what do you do if an outsider wants to sit quietly in your, and observe your session meeting?
That's fine.
Can?
That's fine.
That's right.
Once you've announced that it's a closed meeting, anyone can come.
Right. What do you do if an outsider wants to speak?
That's the decision of the moderator.
And there has to be a vote to
There
give them
has
voice.
the moderator in the session, yeah. The session should probably vote. Now, you've asked the Women's Association to come and talk about the annual bazaar. You've asked the guy who's head of the working task group to repair the building. Those people are probably already docketed that they're going to speak. But anybody else, as Susan said, the session should vote. Now, when is it inappropriate?
I just have a question on that. It
Go
might
ahead.
be wise to, if you were to vote to allow an outside person to speak, it might be wise to vote with a time limit of some sort, you know, that we would allow this member, this outside person to speak for 5 minutes or whatever, and then we're gonna resume our regular meeting or something.
Excellent.
Because otherwise, you told them you'd allow them to speak, and you didn't give a limit on it, how long, then when do you shut them off?
Excellent idea, excellent idea. When it is appropriate to close the meeting, if you're discussing personnel issues, if you're discussing legal issues, then you should close what we call close the meeting. Close the meeting means anybody who is not a member of the session. You keep the clerk, and you keep the moderator, even if they're not voting members. But everybody else, you clear the room. And you go, and for the record, if you close the meeting, your minutes say, the session votes, we are closing the meeting. It gets voted on. It doesn't say for what purpose, it just says the session is closing to go into executive session. You have your discussion. There may or may not be motions that were made in that. You know, maybe you're firing your pastor. Maybe you're firing your church organist. Or maybe you are deciding whether you can give people raises, or it may be a legal issue. Again, when you come out, your minutes will say, came out of executive session. It doesn't say what you said in the executive session. Not a single word of what was in. If there were motions that were taken that will have consequences that need to be on record. At that point, you will say, we voted to decrease the pastor's time to 2/3 time. And don't have any of the other discussion, but that's out in the open as a consequence. If you didn't come up, if it was more, we need to let you know that there is a potential sex offender potentially moving into our church family, none of that gets reported. The session may have special minutes that nobody sees except the session, but that's another story. So, and it is perfectly appropriate in the case of Broad, was then Broad first before it became Providence. In their case, Scott Carruthers said to the guy, you will leave, you have no right, you're out of here. And then the session went and and if necessary, as Scott said, he said, if you do not leave, I will call the police. They have somebody who is an outsider has no right to be here.
Thankfully, that's a very rare occursion.
Oh, yeah.
We're thankful our elders show up for the
Right, yeah, I mean, yeah.
That's true.
Okay, excellent. Dominant voices. This, in a sense, we covered this. Every session, I can't believe there's a session here who doesn't have somebody who would happily take over your session meeting. So, moderators, this is where you say, okay, Joe, we've heard your view and we value it, and now we want to hear from Mary. Mary, what do you think? Because Mary's never going to raise her hand. Mary will only speak if you call on her. What moderators can do but shouldn't is let the dominant voice go on and on. Or another person you may have is the negative person. It doesn't matter what idea you come up with. It's been tried before and it'll never work. Oh, killjoys. The people who are depressive like that, first off, talk to your nominating committee. We had one, when I was serving on the Presbyterian Historical Society, we had one of those. It didn't matter what you suggested. It couldn't be done, or it had been done and had failed. And we finally went to we had a representative from the General Assembly nominating committee. We said, look, do not renominate this character. He kills everything. You can go to your nominating and say, we really need not to renominate John for another term.
Who goes to the nominating committee and suggests that?
Any member of the session.
Okay. Best to heard from a number.
And the nominating committee will do what it wants. They'll say, Susan and Ginny just have it in for that person. Yeah, and you can also say, well, it was the will of the session that we try this new endeavor, and we'll just see. And now I'm going to call on, don't recognize them. Whatever.
The only thing I think about that is, Susan's question is really a good question. You think, okay, it's a nominating committee. That's typically publicly stated. We elect our nominating committees. So any member of the church could potentially go to a nominating committee, or even non-member of the church could go to a nominating committee. So I really think Jenny would be a wonderful deacon. Have you ever considered her?
Right.
But I think what you'd have to be concerned about is to try to recognize the, we're not we're not trying to influence that nominating committee beyond, you know, their spiritual calling. You know, I mean, it might be okay for a session member to say, as you consider this coming term, you know, we have had so-and-so on the session, and it's been a rather difficult 4 years, you know, and I would like to ask you to consider others, instead of just assuming that we would take this person for 4 more years. You know, we would like to consider some other people, but you wouldn't want to too much undue influence. I mean, if you're a session member and you're telling a nominating committee member what to do, what not to do, you know, it's still supposed to be spiritual discernment of who to pray and nominate.
Absolutely, and frankly, I think every member of the congregation has that. In my previous church, I was the church librarian, along with all the other things I was doing, and I was in the church library, and a fellow member of the choir came in and started telling my dad that he felt he had never been asked to be on the session. And then he started talking, and he started telling me totally inappropriate statements about young ladies in the school in which he was a music teacher, and then going into categories of people whom he was also ascribing inappropriate behaviors to, and I'm sitting there at my desk thinking, oh, I feel creepy. So on, and I was just very glad when he left, and I remember nominating, I was also clerk of session, so I sat next to the pastor, and somebody at the next session meeting says, you know, Joe Shimoli would be a really good, really wants to be an elder. He's been a member here 20 years, and nobody's ever asked him. And I turned to the pastor and I whispered and I said, if he is nominated, I tell you, I will personally stand up and speak against him. And the pastor said, don't worry, Jimmy, we know. But you gotta, you know, if keeping that caveat that Todd just said, because the nominating committee really needs to follow its call. But if you have information, either favorable or unfavorable, really favorable or really unfavorable about somebody, there's nothing wrong with you telling us, nominating committee person, this person either has or does not have the gifts for ministry. Yeah. So, given that, and that it is 12:15, I have a homework assignment for you to do to send to, now the front page is the letter, the back page has some questions. You don't have to answer all the questions, but they're, what I'm saying, what we like you to do is look at this letter and what polity issues does it raise? And the questions are there to stimulate your thinking. And this letter, with the exception of the fact that I changed the names to protect the guilty, is an actual letter that one of my fellow stated clerks sent me last December. I said, I was banging my head like, you've got to be kidding. This we've done, and I guess I really should have stopped and said, do you have any other questions? And I'm absolutely thrilled with all the suggestions up and down